So how did the American Civil War actually start? It wasn't just one single event. It was more like a chain reaction, a series of dominoes just tipping over one after another. And the craziest part? The very first domino wasn't a battle or a protest. It was a plan to build a railroad, a plan that would somehow spiral into the single bloodiest conflict in all of American history.
Back in 1854, this is what some pretty powerful politicians actually believed. They thought they'd done it, found the final solution. And honestly, looking back, it's just incredible how completely and utterly wrong they were. This one law, which was really all about building a railway, would instead light the fumes that blew the country apart.
And that's really the key here. The Kansas-Nebraska Act wasn't the direct cause of the war, but it was absolutely the first domino to fall. It set off this unstoppable chain reaction of violence, political chaos, and radicalization that put the country on a path where war was pretty much unavoidable.
So, what the act did was open up brand new territories to a vote on slavery. Now, the guy who wrote the bill, Stephen Douglas, he was just thinking about that transcontinental railway, but he had accidentally ignited an absolute firestorm out in the Kansas territory. And this is where the first blood would be shed.
The whole idea behind this was something called popular sovereignty. Just let the people who actually live there decide for themselves. And in places like Utah or New Mexico, this wasn't a huge deal. But Kansas was different. It had the perfect climate for plantation crops, and, this is the crucial part, it was right next door to the slave state of Missouri. This made it ground zero for a fight.
And things just went downhill with shocking speed. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, they just poured into Kansas to stuff the ballot boxes. So what happens? The anti-slavery settlers, the Free Soilers, they get furious and set up their own rival government. This wasn't just a political debate anymore, it turned into open violence, with pro-slavery gangs sacking a town and the radical abolitionist John Brown striking back with murder. This was a mini civil war, right there on the prairie.
So you might think, okay, this is a local problem in Kansas, right? Wrong. The shockwaves from this violence didn't stay in Kansas. They traveled all the way to Washington, D.C., and they shattered the entire American political system, turning this regional fight into a full-blown national crisis.
Get this. One of the country's two major political parties, the Whig Party, just disintegrated. Poof, gone. All because its leaders supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in its place, a brand new party rose from the ashes, the Republican Party, founded for one main reason, to stop the spread of slavery into the West. Period.
The 1856 election was fought right in the middle of all this chaos. The Democrats picked James Buchanan, a guy who, let's just say, really didn't like to rock the boat and was pretty cozy with Southern interests. With Southern states openly threatening to leave the Union if a Republican won, the country chose Buchanan. It turned out to be a terrible choice. His presidency would just pour fuel on an already raging fire.
And under Buchanan's watch, two huge events happened that basically slammed the door shut on any chance for compromise. These were the final, heavy dominoes that made the conflict pretty much inevitable.
First up, a legal bombshell from the Supreme Court. A decision so shocking to people in the North that it completely hardened their resolve against the political power of the South and the spread of slavery.
The Dred Scott decision of 1857, okay, this wasn't just about one man. The Supreme Court made this sweeping ruling that 1, black people could never be U.S. citizens, and 2, that Congress had no right to ban slavery in the territories. And here's the kicker. It later came out that President Buchanan himself had secretly twisted the arm of one of the justices to get this outcome. For many Northerners, this was all the proof they needed of a massive conspiracy they called the slave power, a plot to make slavery legal everywhere.
All right, so if Dred Scott lit a fire under the North, what happened 2 years later basically confirmed the South's absolute worst fears about abolitionists.
The man was John Brown, and he's back from Kansas. His plan was something out of a movie: seize a federal weapons arsenal and start a massive slave uprising. The plan was a total disaster. He was captured by a colonel named Robert E. Lee. But here's the crazy part. Many people in the North started hailing Brown as a martyr. For the South, that was it, the final straw. They were now convinced that a Republican president would mean an all-out war on their way of life.
And that brings us to the election of 1860. The country is just a tinderbox, right? Divided, paranoid, and the stage is set for the final act before the war.
The Democratic Party, which was kind of the last thing holding the country together, just shattered over slavery. It split into northern and southern factions. This created a chaotic four-way race that basically cleared a path for Abraham Lincoln to win the presidency with a big electoral majority, even though he got less than 40% of the total votes. The map just showed it plain as day. The country was broken in two.
Look, Lincoln tried to tell everyone, hey, I am not going to touch slavery in the states where it already is. But the South? They were buying it, not for a second. They saw his election as a direct threat, a dagger to slavery's throat, and all those threats of secession that had been bubbling for years, they started to boil over.
In those few months between Lincoln getting elected and actually taking office, the whole thing just fell apart. And President Buchanan, he basically just threw his hands up, saying that, yeah, secession was illegal, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. So South Carolina went first, and by February, 7 states had left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America.
Okay, so the last domino. It all comes down to a standoff over this one little federal fort in the heart of the rebellion, Charleston, South Carolina. This is where Lincoln's promise not to fire the first shot would be pushed to the absolute limit.
A U.S. Army major named Robert Anderson moved his men to Fort Sumter, an island fortress right in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln, who's now in charge, makes a really smart move. He decides to send a ship with just food and supplies. No guns, no troops. He even told the Confederates it was coming. This put all the pressure on the new Confederate president, Jefferson Davis. What do? Let the fort get resupplied, or open fire and start a war?
And just like that, at 4:30 in the morning, the war began. After 34 hours of shelling, the U.S. garrison surrendered. The attack on a U.S. fort, on the American flag, it just lit up the North like a bolt of lightning. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. And that was it. The war was on. But here's the thing. Everybody, and I mean everybody, thought this would be a quick and glorious war. Both sides were convinced that one big, decisive battle would settle everything. They were about to get a very rude awakening, just a few miles outside of Washington, D.C.
The Union Army marched out full of confidence to attack the Confederates. The battle itself was just a total mess. You had inexperienced soldiers on both sides basically learning how to fight on the fly. The Union was actually close to winning until Confederate reinforcements showed up by train and a general named Thomas Jackson earned his nickname Stonewall by refusing to break. The Union attack just crumbled and the retreat turned into an absolute panic all the way back to Washington.
The battle resulted in nearly 4,700 casualties. Now, that might not sound like a huge number to us today, but back then, it was absolutely horrifying. It was a terrifying glimpse of the true cost of this war. And this is really the big takeaway from that first battle. The dream of a quick 90-day war, it died right there in the fields of Bull Run. Both the Union and the Confederacy now had to face the cold, hard fact that they were locked in a fight that was going to be long, bloody, and unbelievably difficult. All those dominoes had finally fallen, leading right to this moment. The politics were over, the romantic ideas about war, they vanished in a single bloody afternoon. So with that illusion totally shattered, you have to ask, what on earth would it now take to win?